Today we're going to introduce you to one of my most favorite of all Mississippi writers, Willie Morris. Come along with us. Let's go explore. You can't talk much about Willie Morris without first paying tribute to Skipper. My Dog Skip was a memoir of sorts written by Mr. Morris about his childhood in Yazoo City, Mississippi with his dog Skipper. It is a fantastic tale for me about the bond between a young boy and his dog. I'm going to sprinkle the other works by Mr. Morris throughout the video so that you can see how many you've been exposed to. For me, North Toward Home was one of those books that made me feel like I needed a dictionary before I could read it. I'm not going to give you a synopsis about each of his books. I just want to expose you to them so that maybe you can look them up and read them for yourself. But I am going to tell you this next story. Located in the middle of Glenwood Cemetery here in Yazoo City, Mississippi, is the Witch of Yazoo, or the Witch's Grave. This story was made famous by Willie Morris's book, Good Old Boy, published in 1971. According to the legend, an old woman lived on the Yazoo River and was caught torturing men that fishermen she lured in off the river. The sheriff chased her through the swamps where she was half drowned in quicksand by the time the sheriff caught up with her. As she was sinking, she swore her revenge on Yazoo City and the town's people. She yelled, "In 20 years I will return and burn this town to the ground." No one thought much of it at the time, but then May 25th, 1904 happened. The Great Fire of 1904 destroyed over 200 homes and nearly every business in Yazoo City, 324 buildings in all. There are many different theories as to how the fire started, but many blame the strong howling winds of that day on the witch. Witnesses to the fire said the flames jumped through the air as if driven by some supernatural force. A group of citizens made their way to Glenwood Cemetery on the day after the fire, and on this very spot discovered that the large chains surrounding the witch's graves were broken in two. Some folks say that a man is actually buried here, but I can certainly find no evidence of that. A woman, in fact, owned the plot where the witch's grave is found. Years ago, the original marker at the grave only contained the letters TW. Did that stand for the witch? The stone that you've been looking at today mysteriously fell and split shortly after it was installed. No one seems to be able to tell me why. The guy working in the cemetery said they constantly repair the chains around the grave, but then they fall apart again. Things around here certainly do seem just a little bit mysterious, maybe. Local legend has it that when all the chains are gone, the witch will return again to exact her revenge on Yazoo City. That's why the cemetery workers work really hard to keep the chain links repaired. You come and visit for yourself and see what you decide. William Weeks Morris was born on November the 29th, 1934 in Jackson, Mississippi. When he was 6 months old, his parents moved to Yazoo City. He was often quoted as saying, "I have no alternative to words." And perhaps that's why for over 40 years he figuratively hit people in the mouth with the controversial issues of his generation. He was first editor of the Daily Texan at the University of Texas in Austin. In 1967, he became the youngest editor-in-chief in the history of Harper's Magazine. And he helped transform what I call the old rag into one of the country's most influential periodicals. Morris obtained prominence nationally as a nonfiction writer, a novelist, a journalist, an autobiographer, and a news commentator, and an essayist. He could often be found saying, "I am an American writer who happens to have come from the South. I have tried to put the South into the larger American perspective." He was Phi Beta Kappa at University of Texas, where he wrote about the twin deities, the oil and gas interests that ran the state. Years later, he quipped, "You could blaspheme the Holy Spirit and the Apostle Paul, but irreverence stopped at the wellhead." Mr. Morris's North Toward Home is sort of an autobiography, and if you want to understand Mississippians of his era, it's a must-read. A few months after leaving Harper's in New York City, he published Yazoo, Integration in a Deep Southern Town. Also in 1971, he wrote Good Old Boy, The Last of the Southern Girls in 73, and James Jones in 78. In 83, he published The Courting of Marcus Dupree. In 89, he published Faulkner's Mississippi. In 95, he published A Prayer for the Opening of the Little League Season. I forgot to mention New York Days, which is his second autobiographical work. In 1998, he published A Tale of Race, Murder, Mississippi, and Hollywood, The Ghost of Medgar Evers. Morris served as a historical consultant for the production of the movie Ghosts of Mississippi. Willie Morris and his wife were just a couple days back from a trip to New York and a screening of his movie about My Dog Skip, when he had a heart attack and died. Willie Morris became the first writer in Mississippi history and only the third person in the 20th century to lie in state in the rotunda of the old Capitol in Jackson. And if you didn't notice, he is buried just 13 paces from the witch's grave, the Witch of Yazoo, that he made famous in his book, Good Old Boy. I hope I've intrigued you enough that you will find a book or two of Willie's and give it a read. And if you're ever in Yazoo City, come visit the Witch of Yazoo and give Mr. Morris a visit as well. Thank you.